Well, hey, everybody, welcome back. Today, we've got a special guest with us, Brent Bretz, who has, we had just such a great time with you the other day, Brent, learning about your journey and all of the work that you do now and the work particularly that you do around psychedelics. You've got an interesting story and background, and you've served our country and have gone through a lot. So maybe, Brent, would you just give us sort of your background? Let's just sort of chat about that first, and then we can talk a little bit more about the psychedelics and how those have helped.
All right. Yeah, my background, I grew up here in Arizona, so I'm a local guy. Back in 2000, because of changes in the family dynamic, I was expecting a child. I joined the military. So I was a pre 9/11 kind of service guy. I got in. I was in for about a year, and then 9/11 happened. And so at that time, I was in the infantry. I was with the combat unit stationed out of Fort Lewis, Washington, and like everything kind of just shifted at that period of my life. So I kind of took my military training a little bit more serious, and I asked for and eventually got the chance to go to sniper school. And so I did sniper school. I passed. I've done some other courses like squad designated marksmanship course, pre-sniper school, sniper school. I also had the opportunity to do like blue force plotting on like an FBCB2, which was amazing to like make sure that we weren't kind of crossing paths with other people in combat. So there was a lot of other logistical classes and schools that I got to attend to while in the military service, and it was absolutely amazing. And then I deployed to Iraq October of 2004, and unfortunately December 19, 2004, I was caught outside of Mosul, Iraq, which is up in the northern part of Iraq, and hit by an improvised explosive device.
Oh, wow.
At the time, it ended up crumpling me around the steering wheel. They had originally assessed me as a KIA. They couldn't find a pulse. I wasn't breathing. I was kind of crumpled in the driver's hatch, and as they went to go pull me out is when I gasped for air. And my team leader kind of tells me the story, obviously, but they changed my casualty at that point, and they made me a priority instead of assessing me as KIA, and they loaded me on a medevac flight. And after that, I had numerous surgeries. So I also kind of have my little claim to fame, and that's the ability to actually tell people that I have died on 3 different continents. So yeah. So
thanks for keeping it a little light. That was a serious story. And you're, congratulations on that. We should check with the Guinness Book of World Records, see if anybody else can claim that.
Make that claim.
You don't want to try for 4, right? I mean, you're not trying for 4.
That's the ultimate goal is 4. So I figure at the end of this lifetime, I'm just gonna go down to Latin America and just kind of live my last of my days out. And then when I get on,
I think it's Antarctica. Seriously, you've got to go for Antarctica.
Oh, right, there you go.
Oh my goodness!
Wow.
It's like the Tom Brady of combat. No more rings, brother. Stay with us, dude. No more rings.
But yeah, so I was pronounced dead at the scene in Iraq, and then I had so many complications that I turned jaundice, hit a temperature of 107, and passed away on the operating room table in Germany. Thanks to some medical doctors, like I did relatively well. I honestly believe that if we hadn't advanced our medical technology and all these kinds of things between like the first Desert Storm, Desert Shield to where it was OIF, OEF, like truly I wouldn't have lived. I also spent some time in the German military hospital. The neurosurgeon, because it was in December, he was going off rotation, and the American hospital in Germany was losing the neurosurgeon. So they sent me over to Germany. I had some amazing doctors and nurses in Germany actually take care of me, and then they flew me into the States. And it was kind of a unique story, but because I was Army, I was supposed to go at the time to Walter Reed Medical Center. And I ended up in Bethesda Naval Hospital with a bunch of the corpsmen and the Navy people. And by chance, because of the damage done to my left arm, it was just so happened that a guy from California was actually there working. He was an amazing plastics guy, plastic surgeon, and he ended up actually being the one that helped save my left arm as well.
Oh.
So it was just like everything just kind of worked its way into that piece, because if I wasn't at Walter Reed, if I was at Walter Reed with the rest of my Army guys, there was a good chance that that plastics guy wouldn't have been there to help conduct that surgery. And so along the way, there was just so many things that fell into place that helped me to kind of like be the place that I am now. And it was just an amazing kind of story. So I spent 6 months and a multitude of surgeries there at Bethesda Naval Hospital. And then eventually I was transferred out to Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio, where I started my rehabilitation there. You know, for your listeners who don't know, you know, like I'm a double leg amputee. I have about 50% use of my left arm. Because of the IED blast, my injuries range from everything from having a traumatic brain injury so severe that I had bleeding on the right side of the brain, you know, and I had a cranial pressure gauge put in. I fractured my vertebrae. I had second and third degree burns down the left side of my body. I had ended up with 2 chest tubes and 2 feeding tubes. Both my lungs had collapsed, and you know, and like all the other numerous things. And I like these medical staff. So just being in the position that I was in, and just being in the right place at the right time, is really what was conducive to saving my life. And so I spent another 2 years at Brooke Army Medical Center, learning how to walk on prosthetics again, and
so we're like three. You're 3 years in at this point, right?
2.5.
Yep. 2.5 years in. Wow.
So I got wounded December 19th, 2004. I woke up about January 5th, 05. I was in a coma that whole time. And then I was discharged out of military service in June of 2007.
Wow.
And because my family is who they are, and just kind of had the insight that they had, you know, I had a cousin at the time who was just out doing fundraising for me and the family, and like helping with that on the financial side, and just, you know, like getting community support. And so when I retired in June 2007, he's like, I built this nonprofit, you know, and I've given it a name and I've done all these things. He's like, but it's yours and it's your purpose. And he's like, I just want you to be able to have something that's yours, that you get to go off. And as soon as I started taking the lead on that, I mean, I kind of get into the story here. I just had some amazing success. One of my biggest supporters was the University of Phoenix. They were giving us Super Bowl tickets. I sat on a board to write full ride scholarships for veterans for University of Phoenix, and we had so few applicants and so many full ride scholarships to offer that any veteran that had written in was given a full ride scholarship at the University of Phoenix, which was amazing. And it was an opportunity to do that. So we had jobbing.com and McCarthy Hard Hat sit behind us and really help us to do a lot of really good stuff. And then I ended up succumbing to some of my own battles, and I had to put all that stuff on the back burner for a while. And just to be very candid, because of the context of this conversation, not only was I suffering with some pretty moderate, I guess, post-traumatic stress disorder issues, but then I was also dealing with an opiate addiction. I had been on a long-term opiate regimen for a long time, and it just got completely and utterly out of hand. And to be open about it, you know, I wasn't just medicating the physical pain, but I was also medicating the emotional pain.
Sure. You know? Well, which makes sense. I mean, 2.5 years in recovery, you talk about pain, right? I mean, you're going to have to manage that somehow. And then the repercussions afterwards of how do you get your life back, you know, and wrestle it from the hand of opiates. And that's where your, you know, second battle started. I mean, that's just crazy.
Yeah. Well, before we kind of go too far, I had one question for you before we go too far, because I have to imagine that, like, you know, we have this idea that we're like kind of programmed with for life, and then when you wake up and it's January 5th of 05, and you wake up in that, and like you're, you know, probably not a lot of recollection of what had happened. Like, what was that like? Because that had to just be, I mean, your entire paradigm shifted in an instant. And I don't think many people this life will realize like what that would be like. What was that like for you, if you don't mind sharing?
You know, honestly, it was so much to deal with at the time, and you know, like I'm in combat, and then the next thing you know, I'm in a bed, and I and my family's there, and I don't know, and so like at first I can't even make the dissociation. I'm like having just really kind of lucid dreams at the same time, so it's just kind of all mixing itself together. And so it took me a couple days to process. And as a matter of fact, my mom will tell you, as she kind of recalls, you know, like she was there when I woke up. And so they're like, hey, you know, I had to ask her. And unfortunately, I had a tracheotomy. And so I couldn't really communicate that well. But I just asked her, I'm like, you're like, what happened? And so she kind of broke it down to me. And I'm like, hey, like, she's like telling me that, you know, like your left arm's messed up, but it'll be fine and all this other stuff. And then I'm like, well, what about my legs? And she kind of asked me, she's like, well, what about it? I'm like, I can't feel them. You know, and I'm stuck in bed to the point where I've lost half my body weight. I couldn't sit up on my own. So it's not like I could like look down and see. I just had to like assume. And so she had to inform me like, hey, listen, they're gone. You know, they were amputated and stuff like that. And so at the time, she'll tell you too. It's kind of funny. I just kind of shrugged my shoulders and rolled my eyes a little bit, and then I just went back to sleep. You know, stuff. It's like,
how do you deal with that, right? I hate to make fun of that, but it's like you're just like, I don't know if this is real or a dream, and you just go back to sleep. Wow, that is amazing.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, and after that, honestly, it was my regiment was literally and legitimately. I'd go to surgery one day, I'd have the next day off, and then the next day was a surgery. And then I'd have a day off, the next day was my surgery, and then like I'd have the weekends off from stuff like that, but I'd still have like physical therapists come in and doctors to check my wounds and all this other stuff. And so there was so much going on that I really didn't have time to be like, okay, well, this sucks. Just sleep, taking nutrients, go to surgery, you know, like skin grafts, washouts, all this stuff. So, I mean, it was intense, to be honest with you. So,
yeah,
I can't imagine.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I know with opiates, one of the with opiate like addiction and dependence, like one of the big ones, like factors is that loss of like hope too, right? Like that loss of hopelessness in the future and all that. And I just can't imagine that combined with that, you know, coming out of like those awarenesses and those experiences to then have that hope removed from that opiate, you know what I mean? And then have to come out of that, like, man, you're an impressive human, my man.
Yeah.
Right. And you know, you bring up a very valid point because, you know, like I had my life plan. I had my course set in life and I knew what I was doing. So it was going to be, you know, like 20 plus years in the military. And then I wanted to get out and I wanted to be a high school educator. You know, that was my goal. And I was content with that. And obviously life had different plans for me, but, you know, like waking up to that, like what does life hold for me now? And I had so few people there to answer the question who were also like previously wounded and be like, hey, listen, this is your situation now, but this isn't going to be the situation it's going to be. So I at first kind of always saw myself always needing a caretaker. You know, I'm going from one of the most able-bodied human beings, you know, like an infantry team leader and a sniper, to possibly having that thought in the back of your head where you're like, man, someone might have to take care of me for the rest of my life. It was that in itself was a very defeating thought. And so,
yeah, that's amazing. Wow. So you said after 2.5 years, you struggle with opiate addiction at that point, right? I mean, you've spent years of being medicated, and now you got to try to come off of that. How does that look?
I'll tell you that was nasty, you know. And if you guys kind of aren't familiar with addiction and PTSD have almost kind of like a similar kind of workings in the brain. So addiction will kick out the need of like food and love and shelter and water as a survival modality. And it'll say, I need this substance in order to perpetuate my survival. So that's when you start having what's classified as an addiction as cravings beyond your natural control. So using alcohol or using opiates doesn't make you an addict. It's when your brain chemistry switches and you start having cravings beyond your natural control. And these cravings can last like decades even after you stop using the substance. And so we get into that, and like even though I didn't feel like there was points in my life where I needed to use it, I'd have a bad day and my mind would just run straight to that thought, and it was just overwhelming. And kind of part of what I tell people is, at first it was a dependency. Like, dude, you're going to be dependent on medications to have just a normal kind of life because your pain's going to be so intense. I mean, your body's messed up, and you go through the throes of that. And then after a while, like the cravings kicked in. And for me, it was a constant battle of just having lifetime sentences thrown at me. Like, you're going to be dependent on like prosthetics to walk for the rest of your life. Like, you're going to have to be dependent on, like at the time there's like, you're going to be dependent on pain medications, and you're going to be dependent on all this other stuff in order to like alleviate your symptomology from post-traumatic stress disorder. And so when they told me that I was an addict and what defined it, it was just like one more lifetime sentence to where it was like, there's no escaping this. And that's what they told me at the time. They're like, there's no cure for addiction, and it is what it is. Wow. And so as we kind of continue in this conversation, that's literally, like cued like 10 years past me being wounded and struggling with surgeries and all these other things. And then like a battle with opiates to the point where like I did have points of sobriety, but I mean, they would last 3 or 4 months, and then I'd have my typical relapse, as you see with most addicts, is what, like got me into and wanting and willing to try psychedelics. And that story in of itself is a powerful one, and it's absolutely changed my life, and it's changed my course in this world and the things that I do now. So
how did you get introduced to psychedelics in this process? That's my question, right? I mean, I can't even imagine. It's like you've seen these reaction videos of people being sentenced to a long prison sentence and the look on their face, in front of a judge and jury. And it's like you just went through an experience where you just had a half a dozen or more of those hit you. It's like every time you feel like you accepted the last one, somebody else stands up and says, "Oh, and by the way, you're going to have this now too for the rest of your life." I mean, it's intense. It's an intense human experience to even try to contemplate. But then the addiction piece comes in. So how do psychedelics come into the equation? I mean, is this something? Did you meet somebody, or were you reading about recovery, or how did that work?
Honestly, it's kind of a cool story, but I was dating this young lady. She was actually living with me at the time, and she had a younger brother who was getting into this with all of his friends, and he stumbled upon a bunch of literature, but it wasn't for addiction. It was for post-traumatic stress disorder and the treatment of that. And at that point, I probably would have done it anyways, but at that point I was also so desperate for outside of the VA and the benzodiazepines and the rest of these medications that I'm like, screw it, let's try it. And so, like I said, the crazy thing about it is even during my points of sobriety with my opiate addiction, I knew that I was an addict because I still had cravings. The first thing that I'd wake up in the morning and do is crave opiates, whether I was like using or not. And so I did my first initial session with her, and I did 3 grams of psilocybin, and I just laid in bed with her, and I just talked about a bunch of stuff that just kind of came to mind. And I woke up the next morning, and lo and behold, like I just got out of bed, I went into the kitchen, I made something to eat, I'm like doing my breakfast, just kind of like hanging out, and then I'm like going back down the hall after like spending quite a bit of time in the kitchen, and it just hits me. I'm like, I have not had a single craving this morning.
Wow.
Oh, how powerful is that?
That is intense, right? You try it, you're just desperate. You're like, it doesn't really matter at this point. You try it because there's a little bit of evidence on PTSD. And for the first time in a long time, you realize that there was a byproduct that came out of this process.
Yeah, absolutely. And wow. I mean, that byproduct has been with me since that day. Like I used to have at least 12, 15 cravings for opiates every single day. Like I'd get in a little fight with somebody, and like the brain would kick into that mode, be like, yeah, you need opiates to suppress this. And I haven't had a single craving since my first initial session with psilocybin.
Wow. And so if you don't mind me asking, I mean, you had this, you said it was 3 grams. Was that the dosage that you tried?
Yes.
And how often were you doing that? What was that? What did that regimen look like after that?
So we did it on a Friday night, and then not the next Friday, but the Friday after that, we did another session. Huh. And then I didn't do another session for about like 6 months, maybe a little bit longer. And then me and the girl weren't living together anymore, but I'm like, hey, can we do another session? Call her up.
No kidding. That's that late night text. It's not a booty call. It's a shroom call. Right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. WYD like, mushroom question mark.
Yeah, exactly. You know, and she had until recently, because of stuff that she has going on in her life, she was one of my biggest advocates for psychedelics and psychedelic support. You know, like I grew up in a predominantly LDS household.
Yeah.
So for a lot of them, this was a controversial conversation, and I don't think they really got it then, but I think they definitely got it now. And it's funny because like just seeing the evidence-based stuff from you know, like predominantly LDS family, they all support what I do now, which is absolutely amazing.
Well, I mean, isn't that sometimes it's like, you know, I think, I don't know if you've ever read about this black man who goes out and becomes friends with Klansmen, right? And it's like when you know, and it's really interesting. There's like a documentary on this guy, but he's, you know, he has intentionally said, look, I don't know if people are really racist. I just think they're not exposed to, they just don't have any exposure to anything outside of the people that live in their neighborhood, you know. And when they have that experience with people from a different perspective, they're like, well, this guy's just a regular guy. And I think it's the same thing with things like cannabis or like, you know, psilocybin or whatever it is. It's like, it's real easy when it's somebody else to be like, oh, they're bad people. But then when you see that face to face and your family sees the, you know, the struggle that you went through and now this essentially cure or solution, it's really hard to deny the facts when they hit you right in the face.
Yeah. Well, how long ago was this, Brent? Just out of curiosity.
That was 6 years ago.
Wow. And I mean, I know, you know, we probably met 4 years ago, Brent, I think. And, you know, I didn't really know about your psychedelic background until just recently when we were, you know, having this conversation about the things that Bryce and I and our team are working on with Mindsley. But so how did that change sort of the course of even the work that you were doing at the time, right? You mentioned about being in this nonprofit and working with veterans. I mean, how quickly did that sort of, you know, obviously you became an evangelist pretty quickly of, you know, this product, right? So how did that work? How did that look like? What did that look like?
Honestly, you know, I did, like I said, I kind of did my first initial session with this young lady about 6 years ago. And then it took me about a year to kind of just iron my own stuff out. And I took some time off to really get my own house in order at that point. And then after that, I became a really huge advocate for psychedelic and psychedelic work. Within my work in the nonprofit, you know, like I got in 2007. I saw the needs of the veterans kind of change as like that dynamic change, but I've always felt that there was one crucial missing piece. And for me, being raised the way that I was, and for having all the experiences that I've had personally in my own life, I knew that there was an aspect of spiritual healing that we weren't just touched, that there just wasn't being touched with these guys. So we were healing the mind and healing the body. And again, a lot of this work was being done outside the VA, and I hate to say it that way, but you know, like we were looking at people's minds and percussion concussions and the rest of these things and post-traumatic stress disorder, and like how do we really kind of dive deep into this? And it seemed like the one modality that was missing, the one crucial modality was missing was spiritual healing, and then actually kind of getting in and digging out the root causes of all these things. And so just to kind of give you a little bit more about my background, you know, I also at one point had started a nonprofit. And unfortunately, COVID kind of had sidelined it. I worked with a couple of guys to publish a music video about the 22 epidemic. And then when I sat down with my board of directors, I'm like, listen, we could talk about suicide all you want, but what we need to really address is the root causes of these things.
That's right.
The depression, the anxiety, the post-traumatic stress disorder. Like these guys aren't normal, but they don't understand the chemistry has changed in their brain. And so And so when I stumbled on psychedelics, it literally kind of filled almost all of these niches at once. And I'll kind of explain how that goes.
Yeah,
if you got a moment, I'll kind of dive into this.
Yeah.
When war fighters are constantly engaged in these high risk activities, even outside of combat, what it does is it works its way to the amygdala, which is the fight or flight part of the brain. And that amygdala becomes hyperactive, and it kind of hijacks the thoughts from passing through the amygdala into the hippocampus and into the prefrontal cortex, where the logic and reasoning resides. So you see a lot of these guys just be reactive. So we found out that psychedelics actually calms down the overactive amygdala and allows those thoughts to pass through the amygdala and into the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex. So there was that. There was also a great anti-inflammatory regimen within psilocybin that we found, greater than corticosteroids, that would last up to 6 months after treatment, which also helped bring which actually helped bring
serious. 6 months is a long time.
Yeah, it is, and we found that it helps bring the inflammation out of the brain. You know, so you have these overactive amygdalas, and they become inflamed, and it pulls the inflammation out of these amygdalas, and it really, you really see the notable difference. And so then we also talk about the spiritual healing of people. We tell people to be open to like the spiritual aspects of what psychedelic experiences can bring to you. We're not talking just about psilocybin, but we're also talking about these guys that are out doing DMT.
Right.
And DMT is a powerful kind of catalyst to getting into doing some spiritual work. And so then we also see how this renegotiates neural networks and kind of helps us to kind of reset the brain. And we see the studies where it talks about anxiety and depression and PTSD, but we also are very cautious to tell our veterans and anybody that we work with that their aftercare is super important as well. And I know that's one of the things that we discuss. So we talk about, you know, like implementing, and while these changes are occurring, like very, very intentionally, like having an attitude of gratitude, you know, it shows by itself helps change the chemistry of the brain. And then we incorporate that with some psychedelic work, and that becomes even more powerful and more potent type of work as we reinforce two modalities to make both modalities more effective. And so kind of my point that I'm saying is that with all the missing components to what I've been doing in the veteran community and doing all of this work, you know, this has been the biggest piece for me for healing my veterans and getting my war fighters back into the community and getting my war fighters back to their families and getting my war fighters to be what they were prior to all this combat experience and all the shame and the blame and the bullshit, and being told by the VA that we didn't have any way to really heal this besides years and years and years of counseling. And some of these guys didn't have that kind of time to work with.
No. Well, because the real enemy at that point becomes yourself, right? I mean, you're still fighting an enemy. It's just self at that point. And if you can't get that rectified quickly, who knows where you're going to end up. And back to your point about suicide with veterans, I mean, that's a lot of the reason that happens is they can't beat that. They could go to war and defeat an enemy, but they can't come home and defeat themselves.
Well, I think we were talking about it the other day when we were at lunch too. Yeah. You know, I think it's, you know, the numbers now are that we've lost 5 times the amount of veterans to suicide that we have to combat, which is absolutely, that's what the stats were. I think it was last month when I looked them up, you know, and one of the things that we talked about, Brent, that I really loved that you brought up was that integration piece. And we talked about that at lunch because I think it's such a big deal, you know, and we talked about the stats, and what was it, like a 20 to 30% reduction in symptoms was like the best hope that we had for veterans struggling with PTSD. And now with some of the trials, the numbers that I'm seeing are like 70, 90% cure rates after a year. Like that's incredible. But you know, when you were getting into this, like you said, because there wasn't a lot, I mean, psychedelics, if you think about last year in psychedelics and how little information there was, right? For like the listeners now that are, you know, seeing it on TV and all those things, when you were kind of getting into this, like you were really the only support. Like there wasn't other, like a ton
that's
of
true. Yeah, you're talking 5 years ago is a long time in the psychedelics world, right?
Like, I mean, that's a guy. What was that like?
You were like Christopher Columbus on the boat.
Yeah.
You know, I'll be honest with you, and like I said, I think for me, timing has been so crucial with every piece of my life. You know, like just like I said earlier in this conversation, like ending up at Bethesda Naval Hospital instead of Walter Reed. You know, like being the token Army guy in the whole hospital. You know, like I had the comment on the Marine Corps being like, "Hey, how's my token Army guy doing?" You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
like,
totally.
Is that kind of crazy thing? I'll be honest with you. Like at the time, I had just gotten through my second divorce. That didn't last very long because of all the stuff that I was dealing with, and you know, like she just couldn't handle it. Opiate addiction, PTSD, being disabled, whatever else it was. And so that only lasted 4 months, and that kind of wrecked me for a while. And then when I met this young lady, and I'll be honest with you, like she was 10 years younger than me. She was, you know, like just very calm with me all the time, you know, like kind of like what I needed. And it was her and her brother. And that was it. Those were my advocates in the psychedelic world. You know, her advocating me doing it because she had experiences herself. And then him being the guy that was like, hey, this is the information about, you know, like the post-traumatic stress disorder. And this is something that you're like, we should have a conversation about. And I like the whole thing became just
all came together.
Like, yeah, like like it just worked like piece by piece. And the timing was just immaculate.
That's amazing. And I mean, you really have become an advocate. I mean, it's you know, the conversation that we had over lunch the other week, I mean, you're making an impact here. And one of the things I wanted to chat about was, you know, overcoming a lot of times, I think a lot of military guys, when they get out, you know, they go into law enforcement, they want to continue to serve. And then here's Brent talking about, you know, drugs. And they're like, wait a second here, bro, this isn't cool. How do you overcome that? Because opiates are legal. I mean, they're incredibly damaging, but they're legal. And so many folks are addicted to them. Yeah. And then here you're like, hey, here's something that, you know, we can grow in our backyard that has a solution. And they're like, yeah, but technically it's against the law. It's like, how do you overcome that conversation?
You know, for me, it's really kind of, it tends to be difficult sometimes, especially with my war fighters, because my war fighters, you know, like not only the legality parts, but they were told that they're trash people for doing drugs. And so sometimes it just has to sit them down and be like, listen, we're going to hack into your logic and reasoning. Like, so like, don't let your amygdala take over and hijack this conversation, and don't be reactive. Sit down and have a conversation with me, and let's logically have this conversation. And I'll be honest with you, it's kind of funny because, not to disclose any names, but I literally just treated a sheriff's deputy who was prior service Marine. Yep. You know, and like he was still doing stuff for the county and stuff. You know, he's like, I get it, because that conversation took that piece, but it's difficult. And like I said, a lot of times we just have to be like, listen, your dinosaur brain's going to want to take over. Be like, I don't have any need for this. I want to kick this conversation out, right?
Yeah.
So you get to that conversation, like we just have to present information that is pertinent and relevant. And so whether it's them dealing with PTSD or one of the many other things, we just open up the research notes and like, this is what you need to review and this is what you need to look at.
Well, and your story, Brent, is I think testimonial in and of itself, right? It's like nobody can say, well, I had a harder time than Brent did, right? They really pretty much can't. So all they can do is say, well, if it works in that extreme, maybe it will help bring me some relief. And I think that's why I was so excited to be able to get you on, you know, to this conversation, because I really feel like, you know, I'm even thinking about some Navy friends that I have. I'm going to send this, you know, interview off to once we publish it and be like, hey, you should check this out. Cause I know they know guys that are struggling 20, 30 years later. They're still struggling with these issues.
Well, yeah, absolutely.
When one of the things I want to ask you, because I know we're kind of getting to time here, but you know, one of the things, and you said it, integration is such a big piece. And I think for a lot of people who maybe are curious about psychedelics and that, and I think that, you know, now a lot of people will go away to a psychedelic center to have that experience, and then they just come back to their life exactly the way we left it. And I think that you probably see this more than most, that we have our maladapted rituals each day that we've developed in that kind of imbalance, right? When like our symptoms are out of control and we don't know how to manage them. When you're dealing with a veteran, not only are they having a new awareness about their life and themselves, but they're also now having to like kind of integrate that into the world, right? So that they can have lasting success and actually feel the relief of the treatment they just did. What does that process look like for you when you're working with like your combat veterans? Because that has to be a massive piece of this.
It really is a massive piece. So like my whole integration piece is the pre-psychedelic work. like helping them understand what's going to happen, what could happen in that piece, and to have some realistic expectations, but to really set some intentions for the psychedelic experience itself. And whether that is just to have a better understanding of self, or to have a better relationship with the family, or whatever it is, to have that in the mind as we kind of go into these experiences, and then to be open during the experience itself to kind of receive whatever the plant medicine is trying to tell you. And it'll dig deep into the brain in places that you have shut off and put in the back closets of the back closet. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And it'll draw that stuff out, and it'll kind of make you address it. So I tell my veterans to be prepared for that kind of stuff, and just to let the work happen. But like we had that conversation, and for me, it's the aftercare, the integration of aftercare, and to understand the neuroscience behind the other modalities. Like I said, like having an attitude of gratitude, and how that, like, wake up and intentionally be grateful for the things that you have in your life, and how that changes the neurochemistry in and of itself, which is an important and powerful conversation by itself. But then when we integrate psychedelic work into that, into the breaking of these routines and these regimens, because of the effects that psychedelics have on the brain, like the neurogenesis effects and those kinds of things, then we're reinforcing neural networks that are good and beneficial, and that we back that up with already existing neuroscience. And so, the integration part is super important. Like you said, I agree with you completely that the psychedelic experience is 10%, in and of itself. But what's really important is the next month or two after the psychedelic experience, to give yourself the opportunity to see things in a different perspective, and to really kind of integrate aftercare that is beneficial for you.
Yeah.
And it reminds me of something, and I want to bring it up here as we wrap, because I think it's important for people to understand what the psychedelic experience does. And I heard this analogy. It was in one of these documentaries about psychedelics. There's so many that have come out in the last couple of years, but they said, if you think about a mountain with snow on it, and if people are sled riding down that mountain, eventually it forms grooves, and no matter where you start on the mountain, you're going to end up in one of those grooves, because everything is sort of funneling in that direction. And the analogy was that psychedelics essentially wipes out the snow on the mountain and relayers it back over, so that you don't have to fall into those old things. And Brent, I think it makes so much sense when you talk about 90% of the work happening outside of the actual psychedelic experience. The psychedelic experience is the reset button, but you will tend to go back to those old things if you don't have that conversation afterwards, and even beforehand, of setting the intention and making sure that you're integrating this into part of your life. And it just gives you that opportunity to sort of press the pause button momentarily and sort of reset the pieces on the table, and take an objective perspective on those, and find a path forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to, get my plug in why I'm here and we're having this conversation.
Please plug. Yes, do it.
Please. Yes.
Absolutely. So I now, just so you guys are aware, I now lead Decriminalize Nature for all of Phoenix. So we're not talking about doing psychedelics and the integration. We want to make this available for community events. And so we've already sat down with some of the municipalities, one of the Pinal County District Attorney, I'm going to throw him under the bus, and a couple other legislators. And even I've tabled this conversation prior to COVID, even at the House of Representatives. So we're not just trying to integrate these into the community events to just kind of like, hey man, do psychedelics, it'll change your life. We also want to make safe spaces to the point where we bring these things to be legal, or at least decriminalize them, to help people kind of overcome the stigma of, like, I don't want to be arrested for going out and trying to find healing, because I believe in what we're doing so much. And it's great because I'm not getting much backlash on the conversation side. Be like, well, I don't know about this. I'm like, listen, I'm sitting down with some intelligent people, that that are on city councils, House reps. I'm like, this is where it's at, and it's great too, and I'll be honest with you, just kind of running from where I've been at with post-traumatic stress disorder and all these other things. And, like 6 years previously, I was addicted to drugs. My life was barely held together, and now I run multiple nonprofit ventures. It just, like started to launch another one to build housing, transitional housing for homeless veterans, and we're already having like huge success with that. I mean, like this is life-changing stuff. So where I went from having a drawer full of pills for depression and nightmares and all this kinds of stuff, to where I take just a high blood pressure medication at night now. That's the only thing in my regimen. That's literally it. And I'm like, this is such a strong and powerful testimonial at this point, just to see where I was 6 years ago to where I am now, and just being able to contribute. And I'm like, if we can get our warfighter community back to being service members in the community, what an impact that'll have. And what if we can get people back to being fathers and husbands and wives and moms and all this other stuff, and give them that potential to get back into that capacity, if not like fully, to some degree better. And the conversation that I love having with these people, it's like, it may not make everything 100% better, but I promise you this will, if you allow it to, improve your life.
That's awesome. I'm going to leave it at that. Other than, how do people get a hold of you, Brent? Yeah, I mean, like, I hate to even interrupt that. You just closed it out.
Bro, you're such an impressive human. I know that people are going to want to reach out and support. Yeah.
Yeah. How do people get a hold of you? I mean, what if they know a veteran that's struggling, or if they're a veteran themselves and they just want to have a conversation, or maybe they want to donate to your, how do people get a hold of you?
So, I guess there's a couple ways to get a hold of me. They can either call me. I'll give you my direct line because it's actually my business line. But my phone number is 253-228-0255. I have that line. I got guys that call me at 3 o'clock in the morning, be like, hey, I'm having a rough time of it. So that number is always available. And then I got a couple of nonprofits too with web pages. So azheroestohometowns.org. That's just a community-based level, like, nonprofit that helps with like paying bills, networking, getting jobs, that kind of stuff. And then we also have patriotproject.org. That's the newest nonprofit, and it's PATRYOT project.com. And so that's the one we just launched to build housing for homeless veterans here in Arizona.
Awesome, man. Thank you so much. We got to do this again. Well, I just feel like we could have we talked for 42 minutes. I feel like we could have talked for 8 hours. There's just so much to unpack here. But all right, thank you.
And we want to thank you, man, for all the work that you're doing, not only for our veterans, but for the psychedelic community and for our neighborhoods, man. So please keep doing
for our country. I mean, you really, just your sacrifice is truly incredible. And, I guess if you look at what's the bright side, the silver lining is, all the people that you're going to get the chance to help and that you already are out there helping, which is pretty amazing.
Changing the planet, brother. We like watching it, man. Keep it, buddy.
All right.
Hey, thanks for your support. Awesome, guys.
Yeah. Thank you all. And until next time, we'll keep talking psychedelics.